Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, Speak Crime to Me. My name is Elena. So on today's episode, I am going to recap a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday of the Murdaugh trial. The state did arrest on Friday, so let's see how they wrap things up. Wednesday, the prosecution started with a new witness, David Owen. He is a SLED agent. He got to Moselle around midnight the night of the murders. He was then appointed the lead investigator of the case. They asked him if Alec Murdaugh seemed like he was under any drugs or intoxicated. He said no. David Owen asked for his clothes that evening, and Alec Murdaugh happily provided those. However, we still know that the clothes that Alec Murdaugh was wearing when he was out and about with Paul a couple hours earlier have still been missing. So they were asking for his outfit that he was wearing when he called 911. And Owen, the SLED agent, said that he investigated Moselle and saw no evidence of forced entry, any fight or scuffles. I don't really understand this, but it sounds like Alec Murdaugh admitted that some of Paul's friends were over there or had just arrived after the murders. It wasn't very clear, but I guess this comes back to the fact that one of Paul's friends' DNA was found on Alec Murdaugh's white shirt. Alec Murdaugh started bringing up that story again about CB Rowe. This is the caretaker of the property, and this is where this weird story that Alec Murdaugh started talking about with that they were like, he was in a SEAL operative secret mission or something like that. Then Agent Owen did interview CB Rowe and got his alibi and everything checked out. He asks again about Alec Murdaugh going to the kennels that night, and Alec Murdaugh insists that he was not there. I think it was specifically like, were you at the kennels at 9 p.m.? And Alec Murdaugh said no. Then on July 8th, Alec Murdaugh calls investigator Owen and asks about his car, saying he's getting ready to go on vacation and he needs some golf clubs or something out of his car, and Owen says that the car is inoperable at the time. Alec Murdaugh gives up the information that Maggie came home that night because she was very worried about him and her father-in-law, Alec Murdaugh's father. However, we do know now that that is not true, that Alec asked her specifically to come home that night. A question that was asked when Owen was questioning him was that Maggie was supposed to go with you to your mom's house that evening, so instead of calling or texting her, why didn't you just stop by the kennels? And he says, well, I don't remember that was supposed to happen, meaning he didn't remember that Maggie was supposed to go with him that night. He asked him how long he stayed at his mom's that night. He said 45 minutes to an hour, which we know has been proven untrue. And talked to him about that video that everyone says it has the three voices, Alec, Paul, and Maggie, and he said that's not him on the video. They start interviewing him about how to properly load a shotgun. Again, not exactly sure where they were going with that, but wanted to mention that. And then they start talking about the guns that were used that night. And Alec Murdaugh was the first person to come forward about the .300 blackout rifle that was used, and says he's the one who brings up about the replacement rifle. Just starts to ask him more specifics about that night. How long did dinner take? He said 15 to 20 minutes. Owen starts telling him that they know family guns were used in the murders. And then they start talking about the multiple shooters, and if there was multiple shooters or just one, or they go into more detail like, was there 2 or 3? And then Alec Murdaugh makes a really weird statement. He says like, well, when you get my car information, that will help his investigation. Super strange. We know that that did not help Alec Murdaugh, so not exactly sure why he said that statement. Then Agent Owen is very upfront and basically asks Alec Murdaugh straight up, did you kill Paul? Did you kill Maggie? And he says no. And, then Owen just really starts to go through all the inconsistencies of Alec Murdaugh's statements and interviews to see if he would bite, but we know he did not. And then the defense starts interviewing Agent Owen and basically starts to say about how SLED didn't preserve the crime scene. Well, talks about the impossible timeline of like when Alec Murdaugh would have had to commit the murder. So like say like 8:45 and then he was in the car like shortly after 9. Points out that there was no blood, DNA, or wet spots found in the car, as well as no blood evidence on any of the carpet in Moselle. Also points out that SLED tested Alec Murdaugh's white shirt. However, we know that that is probably not the outfit he was wearing when he committed the murders, and says that there's no blood found on the white shirts. And then apparently when this case went in front of the grand jury, this Agent Owen testified to the jurors that there was blood found on Alec Murdaugh's white shirt. So they go back and forth about how Agent Owen misled the grand jury. And then that is how Agent Owen's testimony ends, and the prosecution brings another witness, David Grubbs. He is with the South Carolina Attorney General's office. He's there to talk about downloading and analysis of cell phone data. Started going into like how Paul would let his battery die often, but then would charge the phone within a few minutes after it died. Again, just starts to go into the orientation of Maggie's phone. Nothing really new relevant with this interview, but that is how we ended Wednesday. So let's see what happened on Thursday. So the prosecution starts with a new witness. His name is Kenneth Kinsley, Orangeburg County Sheriff Deputy. He took measurements of the Moselle property for a crime scene reconstruction. Really just start talking about the murders and kind of a reenactment of that. Talks about how there was no way that Paul's arms were up, like basically before the person shot him, like was his arms up, and he says no way. Basically says that Paul was shot unexpectedly and most likely by someone he knew. They say that Paul wasn't facing the feed room door when he took his first shot. This Kenneth Kinsley used brain and blood matter to estimate the trajectory of the gun and how the shots happened. Says that the second shot was most likely outside the feed room, and that Paul was most likely moving towards the doorway after the first shot, moving probably slow to the door because he was hurt pretty bad after the first shot. Then they start talking about Maggie, how she was murdered with a military-style rifle. It was a very quick succession, 4 to 5 feet away. And I don't know if you guys remember me talking about the like either a shoe print or something found on Maggie's calf. So this gentleman testifies that it's a tire impression that he thinks on the back of Maggie's calf. So then they start talking about is an ATV tire impression, and the guy, yes, but there's no evidence that someone ran over Maggie with the ATV. So that's very strange. Then they start talking about why he didn't swab more of the Moselle property, and this gentleman testifies because there's really no point because there was tons of family DNA all over that property. Says that both Maggie and Paul, neither of them had defense wounds. And then the defense starts their cross-examination. They start by saying that the second shot of Paul's was done at a 135 degree upward angle. They also point out that this gentleman only looked at body wounds and not of other evidence at the scene. The second shot of Paul's was farther than 3 feet because he saw no damage to the feed room door. Then they start talking about where the shooter was holding the gun exactly, and this person says that the shooter was holding the gun below the shoulder, which is very unusual. And the defense points out then that the second shot had to have come from a short person. We know Alec Murdaugh is rather tall. Then the prosecutions come back and say that, or points out that shooters and victims can move during commission of crimes. And that is how the testimony of this deputy ends. And then the prosecution brings on Ryan Kelly, who is a SLED agent, and he was the one who handled the investigation of the roadside shooting. So he claims on September 4th, he found a Maggie's SUV on the side of a road with a punctured tire, which was strange because that vehicle had run flat tires, so meaning that that vehicle could still move even if it had a flat tire. Then they played the 911 call, and basically Paul Murdaugh. And the strangest thing about this call to me is that he doesn't seem like he's in shock or freaking out or anything like that. He says to the 911 operator that he pulled over because he had a flat tire and that someone pulled over after him and shot him, saying that he lost his vision when it happened and he fell to the ground. He described the person, let me back up. He even did like a sketch analysis of the person who he said shot him, and says that the car they were driving was a newer model color blue Chevy pickup. So then when they started investigating this, they found a gray utility knife across the street that had both Alec Murdaugh and we know Cousin Eddie's, Curtis Smith's DNA on it. Then they recall a story about how when Alec Murdaugh was in the ER, he was desperately trying to get a hold of a phone and no one was allowing him to talk to anybody or get any phone access. And then finally the nurse did, and he was basically trying to get a hold of Curtis Smith, aka Cousin Eddie. Then the investigator or SLED agent starts talking about how, let me back up. So they start talking about how Cousin Eddie lives a very minimal life, and then they start asking Alec Murdaugh how come that they started seeing several $100,000 deposited in Curtis Smith's bank account. Another revelation is prior to the roadside shooting, Alec Murdaugh asked Blanca, who is the housekeeper, for a copy of their medical insurance cards, and Blanca sends him a photo of those. So then Alec Murdaugh finally starts to talk about what actually happened on that roadside shooting. He says that he called Curtis Smith and said that things are really bad and asked if he would shoot him. He said first Curtis Smith was like, no, until he finally agreed to do so. He said that Curtis Smith stopped and pulled up, and Alec Murdaugh stood close to Curtis Smith's car, and he shot him and missed him, but still shot him in his head. Ask was the intent for Curtis Smith to kill him so he could collect on the life insurance, and he says he wanted to let Buster collect on the life insurance because he had now been exposed with all his financial wrongdoings and he had little to no money. They asked, so I guess Cousin Eddie is not really Cousin Eddie. They've known each other for a long time. Cousin Eddie knew Murdaugh's dad. They start talking about, or Alec Murdaugh starts talking about how he would pay Curtis Smith several times a week for pills. And sometimes he would pay him in cash, but mostly in checks, which is what he used the fake forge account for, is to pay Smith for the drugs. He said that Curtis Smith got the drugs from a black guy in Waterboro, and he had connections in Buford. They asked him who else bought drugs from him, and he named several people. They asked, did he owe any money to any drug dealers? And Alec Murdaugh says no. And they ask, why did you lie about what happened on September 4th with the roadside shooting? And he says, because he was in a very bad place. And that is how we wrap up Thursday of the Murdaugh trial. And Friday, the prosecution arrested. So let's see what happened. So on Friday, the prosecution starts off with Ryan. So on Friday, the defense starts interviewing or cross-examining Ryan Kelly, the SLED agent that we left off with on Thursday on the stand. The defense starts talking about Alec Murdaugh's height versus Paul Murdaugh's height and the upward trajectory of the shooting. They talk about the sketch of the roadside shooter and that person doesn't actually exist. Then they start going on this banter, the defense with Ryan Kelly on the stand, basically asking about did they ask for Alec Murdaugh's medical records? And the defense is getting very frustrated, basically saying this is a yes or no, and Ryan Kelly wants to tell a story. And it goes back and forth for a minute, but finally Ryan Kelly says that we wouldn't be able to have access to those medical records. And then the defense is basically like, well, did you ask? We could have granted you permission. And so they went back and forth for a while about that. Defense points out that Alec Murdaugh was trying to kill himself with the roadside shooting. Again, if that was the point, why didn't he just have Curtis Smith shoot him again? Or that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So point out that Alec Murdaugh reached out proactively to confess to what actually happened with the roadside shooting. Then the prosecution comes back to cross-examine Ryan Kelly again, basically talk about how on the 4th and the 6th they had voluntary interviews with Alec Murdaugh and he was had a sound state of mind. That they actually considered Alec Murdaugh a victim of the roadside shooting until September 13th. And that is how the testimony of Ryan Kelly ends. And then the state brings on Peter Rodowski. He's another SLED agent. And this is the last witness that the prosecution brings forward before they rest their case. This SLED agent basically took data from cell phone data and everything and created a timeline so you could see everything on one paper underneath time so people could understand it more clear. He had been working on this timeline for over a year and then found out about that new General Motors data that came through on, I think, February 10th. And that data provided a lot of GPS data along with speed data from Alec Murdaugh's SUV. Start off by discussing that the data on June 7th had 4,820 GPS points. All right, so here we go with a little bit of time information. So we know Alec Murdaugh arrived home at 6:40 from his job back to the Moselle property. At 9:07, he leaves Moselle. And then they start talking about his speed and how fast he's going. So when he leaves at 9:07, at 9:08, he's going about 42 miles per hour right around the area where Maggie's phone was found. And then from 9:14 to 9:16, he was going on average 68 to 70 mile per hour. At 9:22, he pulls up into the Alameda driveway, his parents' house. They point out that Alec Murdaugh was driving way faster on that trip to Alameda than he drove on his to and from work trip. At 9:48, he leaves Alameda. And then from 9:51 to 9:54, he's going on average 74 mile per hour. And that trip back to Moselle, he is averaging 80 mile per hour the whole entire trip. So they testify with this agent that this road that he has to travel from Moselle to Alameda is a very road. It has a lot of potholes. It's not a very clean road. And that even a police officer wouldn't be going 80 mile per hour down this road because of how in bad shape it is. Then at 10:05, he leaves Moselle main property to drive to the kennels. We're going through the timeline. So the last data point on Alec Murdaugh's phone was at 6:52 p.m. until after 9 p.m. But the phone did record steps during that dead period. Shows that Paul was at the kennels about 8:38 p.m. And then at 9:02 p.m., Alec Murdaugh's phone all of a sudden wakes up since being basically silent from 6:52 p.m. They point out that on his drive to and from Alameda that evening, he's making a lot of phone calls, and all of those calls have been deleted from his phone until SLED agents take Alec Murdaugh's phone into evidence. Here is the interesting part, or here is what gets interesting. So there was roughly 20 seconds between Alec Murdaugh arriving at the kennels and calling 911. 20 seconds. Then they bring into evidence a couple of things that we have not heard from, or we have not heard about yet. Paul texts Alec Murdaugh on May 6th that his mom found a stash of pills and asks Alec to call him about that. Then 4 days before the murders, Alec Murdaugh calls the Palmetto State CEO. Remember, this CEO was in cahoots with Alec Murdaugh, giving him money, and then later he's now fired and he has been indicted and convicted of some of these crimes. So he calls this CEO and says that he needs more money. This is 4 days before the murders. Then you see on Maggie Murdaugh's computer history that she is searching for 30 milligrams of Oxycontin. And they testify that 30 milligrams is an extremely high dose of oxy. Most people are prescribed like 5 milligrams. Then the defense cross-examines this lead agent and starts talking about how Alec Murdaugh did not slow down on any part of the trip from Moselle to Alameda, and says that the reason why Alec Murdaugh called 911 within those 20 seconds of arriving to the kennels is because the bodies, his car lights would have illuminated the bodies. This agent couldn't say yay or nay to that. And they point out again, if Alec Murdaugh was the killer, he would have a lot to cover up in such a short period of time. Prosecution comes back and points out a couple of new things. That it's odd that Alec Murdaugh tried to call Ryan Gibson. He was the third call, was to Rogan Gibson. And that apparently, as he was either waiting for the 911 emergency crew to get there, or if this was after they had gotten there, that he is Googling about restaurants or where to find a restaurant. Then this SLED agent says that at 9:06 p.m. that the same person had to have had Maggie and Alec's phone, because Maggie's phone was picked up 2 seconds before Alec Murdaugh called it. They also pointed out that Alec Murdaugh either texted or left Maggie a voice message after finding out about the pills on May 7th, basically saying, "I'm sorry, I love you," and Maggie never responded to that. All right, another interesting thing we find out, that the backlight on Maggie's phone turned off at 9:07 p.m. around the time that Alec Murdaugh's SUV drove right past the area where Maggie's phone was found. Alec Murdaugh drove past that area at 9:08 and then texts Maggie at 9:08 saying that he is going to Alameda to see his parents or see his mom. And then after that, the state rested its case. The defense, without the jury presence, basically asked the judge to throw out this case, saying that the state has not proven their case that Alec Murdaugh committed these crimes. The judge says no, and that any juror at this point could find him guilty. So now the defense side starts, and they call their first witness, which is Richard Harvey. He is a coroner. He's been for 30 years. He says that the time of death was about 9 p.m. Put his hands in their armpits, and that is how he determined his 9 p.m. time of death, but said it was anywhere from 1 to 3 hours of that. So if you look at that, anywhere from 8 to 10 p.m. They're talking about how he usually carries a thermometer with him. I guess a thermometer can help time of death, but for this night he did not, but also points out that thermometers are not always accurate. That ends the testimony of that coroner, and then they bring in a former spokesperson of the Colleton County Sheriff's Department, Shailene Tindall. They brought her on because they wanted to talk about this article that SLED and the Colleton County Sheriff's Department put out right after the death, saying that the public don't need to be alarmed, that everyone's safe, and they basically just go back and forth about why you would put out that statement. She testifies later, they corrected that statement, or they put out a updated article with removing that statement, but then the defense points out that they never removed it from the first article. And that was basically that testimony. So on Tuesday, we'll start hearing from the defense. I don't think they have very many witnesses on their witness list, so we'll have to see what happens. But that is how we wrap up week 4 of testimony, and we'll have to see what happens this coming week. So thank you all again for joining me here on Speak Crime to Me. Until next time.